Sarah Martinez had always been the golden child of the Martinez family. At 28, she was a successful marketing executive in downtown Chicago, living in a beautiful apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. Her parents, Elena and Roberto, were proud of their daughter who had worked her way up from a small-town girl to a big-city professional. Her younger brother Miguel looked up to her, and her extended family often pointed to Sarah as the example of what hard work could achieve. On a cold February morning, Sarah's life took a devastating turn. She had been driving to an important client meeting when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her car. The impact was so severe that her vehicle flipped 3 times before coming to rest upside down in a ditch. Emergency responders arrived to find Sarah unconscious, trapped in the wreckage with severe injuries. Her pulse was barely detectable, and paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her as they rushed her to Chicago General Hospital. For 3 weeks, Sarah lay in a coma. The doctors painted a grim picture for her family. She had suffered massive head trauma, internal bleeding, and multiple fractures. Even if she woke up, they warned, she might never be the same person again. The family took shifts at her bedside, praying, talking to her, hoping for any sign of improvement. Elena barely left the hospital, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs and living on vending machine food. Then, on a quiet Tuesday evening, Sarah simply vanished. The nurses had checked on her at 8 o'clock during their regular rounds, and she was there, still connected to all the machines. When they returned at 9, her bed was empty. The machines were still beeping, the IV line was pulled out, and there was no trace of where she had gone. Security cameras showed nothing. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air. The hospital immediately launched an investigation. Police were called, and a massive search began. How could a comatose patient with severe injuries just disappear from a locked ward? The family was devastated and confused. Had someone taken her? Had she somehow woken up and wandered off in confusion? Days turned into weeks and there were no answers. The media picked up the story, dubbing it the vanishing patient mystery. Elena refused to give up hope. She organized search parties, put up missing person posters throughout the city, and pestered police detectives daily for updates. Roberto tried to be strong for his wife, but privately he feared the worst. Miguel dropped out of college to help with the search efforts. The family was falling apart, consumed by grief and uncertainty. Friends and relatives began to whisper that perhaps it was time to accept that Sarah was gone forever. But Elena would hear none of it. Her daughter was out there somewhere, and she was going to find her. 6 months after Sarah's disappearance, the family had reluctantly begun to accept the unthinkable. The police investigation had gone cold, with no new leads or evidence. Elena had to return to work at the local school where she taught 3rd grade, though she moved through her days like a ghost. Roberto's construction business was suffering because he couldn't focus on anything except his missing daughter. Miguel had aged years in those 6 months, taking on responsibilities far beyond his 19 years. The family dynamic had shifted dramatically. Roberto, once the strong patriarch, had become withdrawn and silent. He would sit in Sarah's old room for hours, staring at her childhood photos and accomplishments mounted on the walls. Elena channeled her grief into obsessive activity, cleaning the house repeatedly and cooking elaborate meals that no one had the appetite to eat. Miguel found himself becoming the emotional anchor for his parents, a role that felt impossible to carry. Strange things began happening around the house during this time. Electronics would turn on by themselves in the middle of the night. The family would hear footsteps upstairs when everyone was accounted for downstairs. Elena's rosary beads, which she kept on her nightstand, would be found in different rooms of the house. Roberto insisted it was just old house settling and grief playing tricks on their minds. But Elena began to wonder if Sarah was trying to communicate with them somehow. The whispers in their tight-knit community grew louder. Some neighbors suggested that maybe Sarah had run away voluntarily, that perhaps she had been struggling with problems the family didn't know about. Others theorized that she had been kidnapped and was being held somewhere against her will. The most painful rumors suggested that Sarah had died and her body had been disposed of by whoever had taken her from the hospital. Each rumor felt like a fresh wound to the Martinez family. During this dark period, Elena began having vivid dreams about Sarah. In these dreams, her daughter appeared dirty and exhausted, wearing clothes Elena had never seen before. Sarah would try to speak, but no words would come out. She would reach toward Elena with desperate eyes before fading away. Elena became convinced these weren't just dreams, but visions, and she started visiting psychics and spiritual advisors, much to Roberto's disapproval. The financial strain was becoming overwhelming. Roberto's business was failing because he couldn't concentrate on work. They had spent their savings on private investigators and psychics. Medical bills from Sarah's hospitalization were piling up, and insurance was fighting to avoid payment since she had disappeared. The family was forced to sell Sarah's car and some of her belongings just to pay basic expenses. Each item sold felt like another piece of hope being stripped away, another step toward accepting that Sarah might never come home. 18 months had passed since Sarah vanished from the hospital, and the Martinez family had learned to live with a wound that never healed. Elena had stopped organizing search parties, though she still called the police detective assigned to the case every few weeks. Roberto had managed to save his business by partnering with his brother, but he was a shadow of his former self. Miguel had enrolled in community college but struggled to concentrate on his studies. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, as if Sarah's absence had physically changed the space. Her room remained exactly as she had left it before the accident, but the family rarely went in there anymore. It had become a shrine that was too painful to visit. Elena had finally packed away most of the missing person posters, though she kept one taped to the refrigerator just in case. Life had developed a new rhythm, but it was hollow and mechanical. Family dinners were quiet affairs with 3 place settings instead of 4. Holidays were endured rather than celebrated. Elena would still cook Sarah's favorite dishes on her birthday, then quietly throw the food away when no one was looking. Roberto had developed a drinking problem, though he was careful to hide it from Elena and Miguel. The community had moved on, as communities do. New tragedies and dramas had taken center stage, and Sarah's disappearance had become old news. Occasionally, someone would ask Elena how she was holding up, but these conversations had become brief and awkward. People didn't know what to say to a mother whose child had simply vanished into thin air. Elena had undergone a profound spiritual transformation during this time. Once a casual Catholic who attended Mass on major holidays, she now went to church daily. She lit candles for Sarah and prayed the rosary until her fingers were raw. She had joined a support group for families of missing persons, where she met other parents living in the same limbo of not knowing. These meetings were both comforting and heartbreaking, filled with people clinging to hope while slowly drowning in despair. Miguel had become fiercely protective of his parents, especially his mother. He watched Elena carefully for signs that she might be slipping into depression or having another breakdown like the one she'd had 6 months after Sarah disappeared. He had learned to read Roberto's moods and would quietly remove bottles of beer from the refrigerator when his father seemed particularly low. At 19, Miguel felt like he was raising his parents instead of the other way around. The anniversary of Sarah's disappearance had come and gone without fanfare. Elena had wanted to hold a memorial service, but Roberto refused, saying it felt too much like giving up. Instead, they had a quiet family dinner and shared memories of Sarah when she was little. It was the first time in months they had talked about her without crying, and for a brief moment it felt like healing might be possible. 2 years and 3 months after Sarah Martinez disappeared from Chicago General Hospital, she walked through the front door of her family home on a rainy Thursday evening. Elena was washing dishes when she heard the key turn in the lock. At first, she thought it was Miguel coming home early from his evening classes. But when she looked up from the sink, she saw a figure that made her heart stop. Sarah stood in the doorway, but she was not the daughter who had vanished. This woman was gaunt and hollow-eyed, her once glossy hair now dull and hanging in stringy clumps around her face. Her clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, clearly not her own. Most shocking of all, she was visibly pregnant. Her belly swollen with what appeared to be a 6 or 7 month pregnancy. The sight was so unexpected, so impossible, that Elena's first instinct was to think she was hallucinating. "Mama," Sarah said quietly, and the sound of her voice broke the spell. Elena screamed, a sound of pure joy mixed with terror, and dropped the plate she had been washing. The crash brought Roberto running from the living room, and when he saw Sarah, he went completely white. For several long moments, the family stood frozen in a tableau of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. Sarah moved slowly, as if every step caused her pain. She set down a small, battered backpack, and looked around the kitchen with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at the same time. When Elena finally moved to embrace her, Sarah flinched away from the touch, holding up her hands in a gesture that was both protective and apologetic. The rejection cut Elena like a knife, but she forced herself to step back and give her daughter space. "Where have you been?" Roberto whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We looked everywhere. The police, private investigators, everyone was looking for you." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She walked to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, as if the simple act of standing had exhausted her. Her hands rested protectively over her pregnant belly, and Elena noticed that her fingers were scarred and calloused, in ways they had never been before. Miguel arrived home 20 minutes later to find his parents sitting across from their returned daughter in complete silence. The reunion he had dreamed about for over 2 years was nothing like what he had imagined. Instead of tears of joy and warm embraces, there was an uncomfortable tension in the room. Sarah acknowledged his presence with a small nod, but offered no explanation for where she had been or how she had survived. The questions hung heavy in the air, but Sarah's demeanor made it clear she wasn't ready to provide answers. She appeared fragile, like someone who had been through unspeakable trauma. Elena prepared her favorite meal, but Sarah ate mechanically without pleasure or gratitude. When Roberto tried to touch her shoulder, she jerked away so violently that she knocked over her water glass. Whatever had happened to Sarah during those missing years had changed her fundamentally. In the days following Sarah's return, the Martinez family discovered that getting their daughter back was both a miracle and a new kind of nightmare. Sarah refused to speak about where she had been or what had happened to her. When pressed for information, she would simply stare at whoever was asking with those hollow, haunted eyes until they stopped talking. The silence was more unsettling than any explanation could have been. The pregnancy was the most obvious sign that Sarah's disappearance had involved trauma beyond anything the family had imagined. Elena desperately wanted to ask about the father, about how this had happened, but Sarah's defensive posture around her belly made it clear the topic was forbidden. When Elena tried to schedule a doctor's appointment for Sarah, she refused to go. She seemed terrified of medical professionals and became agitated whenever anyone mentioned hospitals or doctors. Sarah's behavior was deeply disturbing to her family. She would disappear for hours at a time, only to be found sitting in the basement or hiding in closets. She startled at sudden noises and movements, constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting danger. She had developed strange habits like hoarding food in her room and checking and rechecking that doors and windows were locked. Sleep seemed to elude her completely, and Elena would often find her wandering the house in the middle of the night. The financial burden Sarah brought home was immediate and overwhelming. She had no identification, no social security card, no documentation of any kind. Whatever had happened to her original belongings was a mystery. She couldn't work in her condition and mental state, and the family's insurance had long since canceled her coverage. Roberto and Elena were already struggling financially from the costs of searching for her, and now they had medical expenses and another mouth to feed. Miguel found himself caught between relief at having his sister back and frustration with the new family dynamic. Sarah's presence filled the house with tension and fear. She would have violent nightmares that woke the entire household, screaming in terror at invisible threats. During these episodes, she couldn't be touched or comforted, and would sometimes hide for hours afterward. Miguel began staying at friends' houses more often, unable to cope with the constant stress. The community's reaction to Sarah's return was a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Neighbors who had been sympathetic during her disappearance now whispered about her pregnancy and strange behavior. Some suggested she had run away with a boyfriend and was now back because things hadn't worked out. Others speculated about mental illness or drug addiction. The family found themselves defending Sarah against rumors and assumptions, even though they had no answers themselves. Elena tried to maintain hope that time would heal whatever wounds Sarah carried. She researched trauma counseling and support groups, but Sarah refused all offers of help. Elena cooked Sarah's favorite foods, bought her new clothes, and tried to recreate the comfort of her childhood, but nothing seemed to reach the broken woman who had returned to them. Roberto struggled with anger alongside his relief, angry at Sarah for not trusting them with the truth, angry at whoever had hurt her, and angry at his own helplessness to fix the situation. 3 months after Sarah's return, she gave birth to a daughter in the emergency room of the same hospital where she had disappeared over 2 years earlier. Elena had found Sarah collapsed in the bathroom, and despite Sarah's protests about going to a hospital, there was no choice. The baby was born healthy but premature, weighing only 4 pounds. Sarah's reaction to her newborn daughter was complex and heartbreaking to witness. The birth seemed to unlock something in Sarah, though not in the way her family had hoped. Instead of the joy typically associated with new motherhood, Sarah appeared terrified of her own child. She would hold the baby when necessary, but seemed to view her as a burden rather than a blessing. Elena found herself taking over most of the infant care, a responsibility she accepted without complaint, but which added enormous strain to an already overwhelmed household. Sarah named the baby Elena after her mother, a gesture that brought tears to everyone's eyes. But even this moment of connection was shadowed by Sarah's continued refusal to discuss the child's father or the circumstances of her conception. The baby became both a source of love and a constant reminder of whatever horrors Sarah had endured during her missing years. Elena worried constantly about how this situation would affect the child as she grew older. Financial pressures reached a breaking point with the addition of a newborn. Roberto had to take a second job working nights at a warehouse, leaving him exhausted and rarely home. Elena used her teacher's salary to buy baby supplies and cover household expenses, but it wasn't enough. The family applied for government assistance, a humbling experience for people who had always been self-sufficient. Miguel got a part-time job at a local grocery store to help support his sister and niece. Slowly, painfully, a new normal emerged in the Martinez household. Sarah began helping with household chores and occasionally caring for her daughter, though she still seemed emotionally disconnected from both activities. She developed a routine of long walks around the neighborhood, always returning before dark as if following some internal schedule. She would sometimes sit in the garden for hours staring at nothing, lost in thoughts she refused to share. The family learned to navigate around Sarah's triggers and limitations. They stopped asking questions about her missing years and focused instead on moving forward. Elena enrolled in parenting classes designed for grandparents raising grandchildren, recognizing that she would likely be the primary caregiver for baby Elena. Roberto began attending Al-Anon meetings, finally addressing his drinking problem with the support of others who understood family crisis. Miguel surprised everyone by developing a close bond with his niece. He was the only family member who could consistently make baby Elena smile, and Sarah seemed more relaxed when Miguel was caring for the child. This small connection gave the family hope that healing might be possible, even if it looked different than what they had expected. Sarah might never fully return to who she had been before, but perhaps they could build something new together. 2 years later, Sarah finally spoke about her experience, revealing she had been held captive by a human trafficking ring. Her escape had taken months of planning, and she had protected her family by staying away until she was certain she wasn't being followed. The truth was more horrific than anything they had imagined, but it also explained her behavior and gave them a path forward. With professional help and the unwavering support of her family, Sarah began the long journey of reclaiming her life while carrying the burden of survival that would always be part of her story.